Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And we have a great program for you this afternoon featuring two political experts, Evan Osnos and Pete Buttigieg, here to talk about Joe Biden within a week of the election. But first, for those of you not familiar with how this virtual format works, let me explain that if you want to ask a question of our guests, you can do so by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. The chat function also will be active, and in that column, you'll find a link for purchasing a copy of the new book that Evan has written entitled Joe Biden. Evan's one of the most talented journalists of his generation. He spent the first part of his career overseas, courtesy first of the Chicago Tribune, which he joined shortly after graduating from Harvard, and which 3 years later sent him to the Middle East to report from Iraq and other countries. Next, he went to China for the trip, and in 2008 shared a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. That year, he joined The New Yorker and stayed in China for several more years before moving to Washington, where he's been covering politics and foreign affairs. His excellent book about China, Age of Ambition, won the 2014 National Book Award and was a finalist for the 2015 Pulitzer Prize. His new book is adapted from an occasional series of New Yorker articles he's written over the past decade, including most recently a profile of Biden last August. As Evan says, Biden for him has become an area of accidental expertise. And the portrait he presents of the former vice president in the book highlights Biden's extensive experience, deep empathy, fundamental decency, and language of healing. This is a compact work put together quickly, but written with Evan's characteristic articulateness and insight. And speaking of articulateness and insight, in conversation with Evan this afternoon will be Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and a 2020 Democratic presidential candidate. Mayor Pete also has a new book out, Trust, America's Best Chance. We already did an event for that 3 weeks ago, so the mayor's here to recognize Evan's work and also, of course, put in a plug for his former primary opponent and now enthusiastic pick to be the next president of the United States, Joe Biden. So Evan and Mayor Pete, take it away.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you so much. It's an honor and a treat to be participating under the auspices of a place as iconic as Politics and Prose. And having now had the privilege of appearing there both virtually and in person, I'm delighted to be there once again, especially for a journalist and a writer and an observer of the caliber of Evan Osnos, who I think is so well suited to help really open a window into somebody who, on the one hand, is a very well-known and recognized figure in U.S. politics, and on the other hand, I think even now often misunderstood. And his work covering him before, during, and since his vice presidency, and now into his campaign, I think is crucially important for the country to spend time with, especially if, as I fervently hope, and I won't pretend to be neutral on this one, we are talking about somebody who a week from tonight or very soon thereafter will know as the next president of the United States. So Evan, thanks for the chance to have this conversation. I'm really looking forward to digging in on a number of subjects with you. But let me begin by asking about the role of fate. I think about the first time I worked up the nerve to ask one of my predecessors as mayor, back when I was in my 20s thinking about running, if he thought it might be a good idea for me to run. And instead of directly answering my question, this was Governor Joe Kernan, who had his own remarkable career in Indiana after serving as mayor of South Bend. He stared at his basket of French fries for what felt like a whole minute. And then he turned to me and he said, "In politics, so much is out of your control. And let me know that the first thing you need to think about is to prepare for that." So at a moment when so many Americans feel like so much is outside of our control, and when somebody like Joe Biden is going to be leading us forward, who on one hand, it feels in many ways is meeting a kind of lifelong destiny, and on the other hand, in many ways never knew he would reach this point. I wonder if you could share with us that gripping opening anecdote that you write in the book about his aneurysm and a brush with death. And then more broadly, what role you think Vice President Biden's relationship with the uncontrollable has played in his formation, in his political life, and is likely to play in his presidency?
Well, thank you. I have to say, Mayor Pete, it's a sort of ludicrous honor to be up here with you talking about this subject, and I'm just really grateful to Politics and Prose and to you for taking the time to do it. You've got a very busy schedule right now, and I think and to Brad and Lissa for making space for us to talk about this at a week when a lot of people are thinking about politics. It feels like an important piece of work, and I'm grateful to be here talking about it. Look, you raised what for me is one of the most interesting elements of the story of Joe Biden, and I decided to begin this book with a piece of his biography that is often overshadowed by some of the political milestones. He has a political biography that could fill a book of its own, which in some ways made it all the more reason to begin with something people don't talk that much about, which is that he woke up one morning on the floor of a hotel room in 1987, and he was unable to move his legs. He couldn't figure out how he got there. He had a brain aneurysm. He had two aneurysms, in fact. It was the ballooning of two arteries in his brain. And the description of it was agony. And he was able to get himself onto the bed. They got him to a hospital, and the surgeons told him that he was at risk of such grave injury, could have died so quickly that they had to summon a priest to deliver last rites even before his wife could get there. And Joe Biden had been on the campaign trail for months. He'd had this kind of nagging headache. He'd been putting it aside, and in fact, it was a strange bit of fate that he had dropped out of that race, bombed out of that race, if he was going to tell the story, and the fact that he was out meant that he went to see, he was able to sort of have a moment. He was going and giving a speech, and that's when he was attacked with this aneurysm. So the doctor said to him, look, frankly, you're a lucky man, because if you were on the campaign trail and you continued ignoring your symptoms, you might be dead right now. And they said, Joe Biden, you're going to go under the knife. We're going to give you surgery to try to save your life, and you may lose your ability to speak. And somehow in that moment, I have to note, he did find some bit of humor in it. And he said, I sort of wish that had happened to me last summer. And sure enough, they did operate on him. He did, of course, come through it. And it was an ordeal of the kind that shapes a person's conception of their own vulnerability, their frailty, their role as a father, as a husband, and ultimately, of course, as a political person. He was out of the Congress for 7 months. He comes back. And what I think is fascinating is through his life, you see this recurring pattern of these moments of sort of extraordinary misfortune and, in their own curious way, extraordinary fortune. And I pursued that very question that you started this with for a long time, trying to understand how he conceptualizes fate and control over one's own circumstances. And he's come to a bit of sort of homespun philosophy about it. He borrowed it from his dad, in which he says that everybody in the end has some sort of philosophical cosmic ledger in which the highs, the great highs, will be compensated by the great lows. And that's how he made sense of it in his own life. And of course, it's continued this pattern all the way until today. I think sometimes, though, one of the things that's interesting is he grew up at a time in which there was this great sense of control, this great sense of you could define your fate. That was sort of the American mantra of the post-war period. And I think, and I would sort of put it to you too, I think there is a feeling today that Americans have that they don't have that sense of control. They feel as if things are happening beyond their reach. And fate has become something that is less able for them to define, and it's something that happens to them. And I think that's sort of a nerve ending that sort of runs through our politics to some degree.
Yeah, that leads to something else I wanted to explore with you, which is this question of being shaped by the moment or the generation that you come from. I came of age in a generation that started out with the big argument being over whether it was the end of history, whether things had just settled down and all the tough stuff was over, and we were just going to ease ourselves into a a period of prosperity and consensus with technology, especially digital media, helping to create that sense of fact-based reality and decency. It sounds almost tragicomic now to think back of the way we thought about it in the 90s, but that was the kind of period in which I was formed, only to have history come roaring back at us, starting with 9/11, which was, I think for many of us, the first time that a chain of events that started thousands of miles away wound up affecting us in a very direct way. And I think about that with the students that I now spend time with, the undergraduates I teach at the University of Notre Dame, almost exactly 20 years apart from me. They too have had their lives rocked by a chain of events that started overseas, but in a different way also, I think, feel that their entire experience has basically been, their awareness of the world has been fashioned during the era of President Trump and formed in between the crushing blows of the Great Recession, in which they were gradually becoming aware of the world, and then the pandemic and everything that's happened between. Joe Biden's interesting generationally because he doesn't quite sit in any of the generations about which we have the most convenient political stereotypes, right? There's the baby boomer generation but he would, I think, be qualified more as that what's called the silent generation. He certainly wasn't in the generation that could have been directly involved in World War II, but he wasn't quite of that kind of counterculture 60s moment, which is one of the touchstones that I think a lot of us are using when we're trying to make sense of the 2020s. So I wonder, sometimes he's gets in trouble for being perceived as nostalgic, and at the same time seems to have a very uniquely, I think, a humble conception about how transition and transformation might be the hallmark of his administration. So with all of that kind of in the atmosphere, I wonder what conclusions you drew about how he was shaped both by the moment he came of age and how now he meets this moment, this unique moment of 2020.
Yeah, I found that sort of generational framework really compelling. I mean, there's a way in which, and you've talked about it in your own work and in your writing, and I see it in Joe Biden's life very distinctly. Look, there is a point at which everybody is an individual. You don't want to assign them characteristics that define who they are. But there are certain elements of the moment in which we come into being, in which we come of age, that shape us. And there's a great essay written by who I like to imagine is my former colleague, E.B. White, who once wrote about the post-war generation. He called them the society of movers and doers. And he said it is a very, as he put it, pompous lot indeed. What he meant was that it was a community that felt as if they could do things because there was this, they sort of had the tools to create their own reality. Look, in functional terms, they were coming out of World War II and the Great Depression, in which they were one of the smallest generations, that they were the first generation to be smaller than the generation before them. They had the GI Bill. They had all kinds of very specific advantages that were allowing them to make, I mean, just as a practical matter, because there were so few of them, sociologists called them the lucky few. This is the generation that Biden was part of. That meant that it was easier to become class president. It was easier to become the star in the show, and it was easier to get promoted along the way. And that in its own way, I did think it does shape our politics. It shaped the way that people came to imagine that they had this degree of control. And to some degree, they didn't need to, thinking of a topic we're going to talk about more today, but they didn't need to trust in institutions as much. They could do it themselves. And then you fast forward to today, in which millennials are, after all, the largest generation in American history. They are the most diverse, and they have come of age, obviously, in this time in which you have 2 recessions in 20 years. You have the wars that began with 9/11 and continue, and have given them this very different sense of what they can and cannot control. I think one of the challenges in some ways, it was at some point when I was reporting on Biden for this, I spoke to a political scientist who studies age and politics. And he says there has never been a moment in which the gaps politically, culturally, technologically, ideologically between the generations have felt as pronounced as they are. And I think that it poses a challenge. Frankly, it poses a challenge to you. It poses a challenge to Joe Biden. How do you begin to build for people? And I would put this question to you: how do you begin to pose for people an encompassing identity that allows them to say, look, I'm coming of age at a very different moment, but you and I can find something together?
Yeah, I think this is one of the big challenges right now. And I think so much depends on having some touchstones of shared reality, if they're not generational, then otherwise. I mean, to take one example, the experience of my generation is radically different from the experience of the baby boomer generation and those who experienced the Vietnam era. But I've found that I can walk into an American Legion and have certain terms for talking to a veteran of the Vietnam era because we both had the experience of service. Very different experiences of service, but it was service all the same. It was the same country. Perhaps it was the same branch. And it just gives us a touchstone to then better understand all the things that were radically different. I think part of how American society and communities are supposed to work, something that goes back all the way to Tocqueville, observing the fondness that Americans have for voluntary associations, is that we create these circles of belonging that overlap. I don't belong to your generation, but you belong to my church. You don't belong to my church, but I belong to your soccer team. You don't care for soccer, but we live in the same neighborhood. And the more there's overlap, the more there's some chance of trust. This is another area where technology has been such a conundrum. It shows the potential to cut across our existing pockets of belonging. Theoretically, I can as quickly be in conversation with a elderly resident of Pakistan as I can my next door neighbor. And yet what we've often find is that it's the algorithms serve up to us things that reinforce our pockets of belonging, and those circles that ought to be overlapping increasingly have proven to be concentric, which does a kind of sorting that's very dangerous. And so we're running out of things. I think we ought to create more, like voluntary national service, but we're running out of things that we all have in common. One of the things we all have in common as Americans is the presidency. I mean, part of the point of the presidency is the symbolic, not to be discounted, because the president's a walking symbol of some minimal amount of things that I have in common with people who are incredibly different. We may not support the same person for president, but we have the same president at any given moment. And a president who grasps that can use that in the same way a good mayor knows that they're a walking symbol of the unity or the existence of the city they serve. Something that I had to learn the hard way, because I got here, I took office wanting to do policy. And of course, that was my focus. But I began to lean into, once I admitted how important it was, I began to lean into the symbolic functions of the office and their power. So this brings me to another question that I think is central to Joe Biden's appeal. It's certainly central to his message. And that's this idea of unity, this idea of bringing us together, whether it's across generations, across political boundaries, across regions. As our country has gotten frighteningly polarized and sliced and diced, what attributes did you see, or maybe anecdotes did you encounter that might shed light on how, as president, he would be able to deliver on this appeal and this promise of bringing us together, which is certainly one of the reasons I support him. And I think part of what he has to offer the country right now.
Yeah, you hit on something that is, for me, very interesting, which is this idea of, is it plausible to talk about unity now? Is that a euphemism for inaction, for kind of paralysis, for saying, well, we're just going to come to some mealy-mouthed consensus? And in fact, that's not what it has to mean. I think one of the things that I've always found fascinating is if you go back through his life, or you follow him for a while, what you see is that he has these kinds of what we would call democratic habits, small d democratic habits, these sort of habits of unity. They are ways of establishing connection with people in which you are trying to transcend those boundaries of belonging that you talked about before. I'll give you a funny example. I mean, I've been with him overseas in various places. I've seen him in Beijing. I went to Ukraine at one point when I was following him for reporting. And he has a line. I mean, this is a sort of classic political line, but he has a line that he says to people wherever he goes, politicians, where he tends to say to somebody when he meets them, a fellow politician, he'll say, if I had hair like yours, I'd be president. And he has used that in Baghdad, in Beijing, in Wilmington, I don't know how many times. He probably tried it in South Bend once or twice. And the reason why it works is it's disarming to no matter who he says it to. And there's something in his understanding of how political people function that he said to me at one point, and I think this is sort of a deep truth, that he and Obama have a shared idea that unity is possible. That's the thing that brought them together. And then they go about it in slightly different fashion. Of course, Obama has this ability to use really a sort of transcendent sort of language that just sort of reaches down into your soul and finds this thing that you may not have had a name for and puts it out there. And you begin to feel elevated by it as an American. That's what we saw at that 2004 at the famous moment when he sort of emerged for Americans, talking about not a red American, a blue American. Joe Biden does something that's more functional. It's more practical. It's that he believes that, as he said to me, he said, look, a lot of diplomats don't like me because when I start in on a process of negotiation, and the same thing applies in domestic politics, my first idea is that I can't say something to somebody that I think is bullshit. He said, I have to understand that they have often a rational conception of their own interests. And you have to sort of, from the very beginning, just acknowledge that they have a claim, acknowledge that they have something that is worth listening to. And I know that sounds like almost banal, except that it's a radical notion in Washington tonight, right now, to say, I'm going to have the conversation. But I bet, I would be curious. I'm sure that you encounter people along the way who say to you, look, Pete, they say, I'm the same age. How can you look at our politics and think that unity is possible right now? Yeah. How is it not that we need to just fortify our own tribe, in effect, and prepare for scorched earth?
I think all of us think about this through the lens of our experience. So for me, a lot of the redemption comes by way of the local. I've been in so many local political processes, which are no less ferocious than national politics in terms of how fired up we get, with one important difference, which is the coalitions aren't quite as stable. They're not predicted by what party you're in. And so the same person who might be at my throat and vice versa on a zoning dispute might turn around and be the swing vote that delivers my budget on our council. The same person who I might be going toe to toe with on an issue of housing policy could turn around and be my greatest ally on a matter of LGBTQ equality that's at stake in some local issue. And because of that kind of shifting nature and the fact that we encountered each other first as human beings, because we see each other. When you're a mayor, you eat what you cook. You're on the same streets and shopping at the same grocery stores as anybody else you serve. To me, that creates a certain level of bedrock faith in the possibility, not that we'll all be unified on what to do. I mean, that's what politics is for, is to adjudicate differences when we have different opinions. But that we can at least arrive at that public square in good faith and not completely blow each other up, because there might be an unlikely, a kind of strange bedfellows moment around the corner where somebody we were fighting on this issue winds up at our side on that issue. I actually think the Trump moment has opened up the possibilities for that in many ways, because, he's done so many things that are as contrary to conservative values as they are to liberal values. It creates maybe a once in a generation moment, especially if the election goes as I think and hope it will in the House and Senate, and really forces the Republican Party to decide what it's going to be next or pick up the pieces. There could be an interesting moment for that. And I don't think that requires any naivete about the cold, hard power politics of Washington. And this may be something else that is a set of qualities that comes together in Joe Biden. Nobody could say that someone with as many years in the Senate as he has under his belt is in any way kind of naive or innocent about how things work. And at the same time, you're right. He really, as he often says, I really do mean it. He really does mean it when he talks about this need to bring us together. And I think you can feel that. I want to mention, I see questions coming in on the Q&A feature on Zoom, and just a little bit later in the hour, we'll turn to those. So please keep them coming. And I'm looking forward to bringing some audience questions in, but not before I share a few more that I just can't resist.
I have to say, you've been Mayor Pete, Slayer Pete, now you're Moderator Pete. I did think
that's right. I'll take it. Great. Good, honest work.
I want to mention something that builds off of what you were talking about before, about that kind of shared basis. There was one of the questions we often hear about Biden is, look, how is he going to contend with the left side of a party that doesn't agree with him on a lot of things and is really suspicious of his fundamental instincts, his motives. And I had a kind of fascinating conversation with a progressive activist who said to me, look, I have been surprised by the degree to which Joe Biden has been genuinely open to what I have to say. Look, before this progressive activist was saying it to me, Bernie Sanders was saying it. Honestly, he said that the Biden campaign has been more open than we expected. Now, nobody is saying this is the Trojan horse fantasy that Donald Trump is talking about, but there is an openness to it. And there was a good example of it that if you take, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been clear that she had her differences with Joe Biden in the primary. And at a certain point, she said, look, if we were in Europe, I might not be in the same party as this person. And, they get to the end of the primary, and Joe Biden could have been within his rights to say, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And instead, what did he do? He said, I'd like you to come in and help write my climate policy. And so that's how you ended up with AOC and John Kerry in a room with a range of different voices representing very different interests. Goes back to that word that is so important to Joe Biden's conception of politics. And all of them were given a chance to speak. And I talked to a progressive activist afterward, Varkashini Prakash, who said, look, I was pleased by how much they were actually, and surprised by how much they were interested in hearing from me. And I think that is it's a tenor, it's a tone. If we've learned anything about politics, it's that tone and tenor really does matter, I think.
Absolutely. And that's definitely his instinct. I think of moments where, look, if you're a sitting or a former vice president of the United States and some dude like a 30-something-year-old mayor shows up challenging you in a contest for the president, and at one point is actually ahead, I would think you would have every reason to say, who do you think you are, or worse. And yet one of the things that I really appreciated about him is at the beginning, middle, and end of the arc of my campaign, when I was up and when I was down, he was equally interested in just being decent and getting to know you and talking to you and building you up in a way that I found there was no kind of break or need to change tone in terms of how he treated me, certainly and also by the way, before, during, and after my decision to support him, which I think just speaks a lot to an instinct that's clearly not only a political strategy, but I think something that's more woven into the core of who he is. I want to talk for a moment about where he is. I believe it's today that he's in Warm Springs, which is a place that, of course, is associated with FDR. And there's I think a growing interest in comparing this moment as we look for anything at all that could possibly seem parallel to 2020 in the past. And there's nothing that quite fits it, but a moment when democracy seems to be in question or in retreat, both here and around the world. A moment when people are hurting in many different ways. A moment when the future of the American project really is in question in many senses. And a moment where perhaps the immediate decisions that are going to be made about managing a crisis will also turn out, by their very nature, to be decisions about what our political and economic order might look like for a generation. You can see quite a lot, right, in common between the circumstances that greeted FDR when he reached the presidency and what would be waiting for a president-elect Biden. I wonder how much you think that analogy holds up, or are there any instructive ways that maybe it doesn't? And given some of the mentions that Joe Biden himself has made of that presidency in that moment, how much do you think that might be part of the way he approaches the historic character of this season in American history that he may well be arriving in as our president?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of Americans, maybe even some who are on this call, who were skeptical of the idea that somebody who had spent his career as an indefatigable centrist would say now that I'm pursuing transformative change in politics. And they would say, well, is that a measure of inauthenticity? And I actually had a conversation with Barack Obama about it, in which he framed it as in this way. And he said, look, it's not that Joe has fundamentally changed his stripes or who he is. It's that the circumstances changed. It is a different country, frankly, than it even was when he entered this race. He understands the structural issues, but we are facing a kind of a functional and moral emergency in a way that we weren't even before. And that calls upon from him this greater ambition for the office. And I think this actually ties into with this thread that we see running through his life, something I tried to capture in this book, which is that in some ways, his ambition to achieve something meaningful in public service is part of the reason why he then finds himself in this moment taking on the mantle, or sort of taking on the aroma of this much more ambitious presidency, even one that he might not have imagined would be his identity before. And it gets to something that I think is a feature of his that we don't talk about explicitly enough, and is worth talking about, which came through in my encounters with him, is that he does something that not everybody in Washington does, which is that he will admit mistakes. And I say this partly because, look, this book is full of examples of him making mistakes, and nobody who's had a career as long as his has been is going to have a life of unblemished choices and decisions. And there are things that he deeply regrets and things that he realizes he didn't fully understand. And rising to that moment, I think, is partly about the ability to be reflective. I mean, I don't need to state the obvious. His opponent is not endowed with those same capabilities of self-reflection. But I'll give you one example that really leapt out to me, which is that after the killing of George Floyd, I said to Biden, I said, look, how did this change you? How did the killing of George Floyd and everything that flowed from that, what did you learn from that? And he said, well, one thing I learned was that I was wrong about something. And he said, I had been telling this parable, this kind of neat fable about race in America that began with me growing up in essentially the Jim Crow Delaware, in which African diplomats going between Washington and New York were stopping at segregated rest areas. And I then became the vice president to the first Black president. And there was in that this kind of satisfying arc of progress. And what I saw, what so many of us saw on that video, was that we were wrong, that this history was not finished, to go back to your earlier point. In fact, this history was ragged and alive, and we were contending with it. And he said to me, I discovered that you can't extinguish hate, that it hides. Hate hides, and it waits for a leader to give it oxygen, and then it comes roaring back. And I think there's an element of that, of him sort of coming to, through the Trump experience, coming to actually even have higher belief in the power of the office than he did beforehand, because he sees what damage it can do. And I think that's been for him a learning process as well.
It's a moment that definitely, I think, can drive people either into their habits or into that kind of reflection. And one of the remarkable things about him is that that he continues to see ways to respond to what's happening and to learn from it in so many ways, and update his account of how the world works, even now, even after so much work done within it. I wonder if you think that's one of the qualities that served him well in the primary. You know, the primary victory really is an extraordinary thing if you consider how much he was written off at various moments, and the fact that he had attempted to run for president before more than once and hadn't fared very well. And, you know, a lot of folks didn't see him getting even to Iowa, let alone past it, let alone earning such a commanding lead coming out of South Carolina, and then pretty quickly after that bringing the party together under his candidacy. So I wonder what you think were some of the factors that helped to account for that and explain that when there was a period where very few political commentators would have described him as the favorite.
Yeah, well, and I am going to have to, we're going to swap hats, because I'm going to have to ask you the same question in a minute. But look, I think a couple of interesting features rise to the surface. One is this was a measure of ways in which my industry, frankly, gets things wrong, because we get locked into certain patterns of understanding, and we say this is what the Democratic Party is today, and it is nothing but that. And we say this is what the electorate is, and this is nothing but that, and this is who Joe Biden is, or this is who Pete Buttigieg is. And then all of a sudden, and so what we discovered in there was something that the campaign had believed from the beginning, which is that the Democratic Party is, most people in the party would describe themselves as moderate Democrats or even conservative Democrats. And even though a lot of us in the press will pay attention to the sort of frontier edge, the newest members or the most public members of the party, that may not in fact be where the main body is. But the other feature of it that I found very powerful was, I was talking to Jim Clyburn, of course, who delivered this crucial endorsement in South Carolina, which allowed Joe Biden to break free and eventually to secure the nomination. And Jim Clyburn, reminded me that, look, he may not look to you in Washington or New York like he's the hippest guy around, but in a place like South Carolina, which after all was contending with a massacre in a Black church at the same time that Donald Trump was announcing his presidency, for us, this is a matter of existential significance. This is not something in which we're going to gravitate just to the newest, most dynamic person. And for that reason, we know Joe, he knows us, And there is, as Cornell William Brooks put it to me, a great civil rights activist, said, look, there is a certain unapologetic pragmatism about Black voters in South Carolina, and that drives them to make some of the choices they made. But Pete, I would ask the same question of you. Were you surprised by the result when it happened? To what degree did you see this coming? And what do you think we got wrong from the outside, right up until the words I just said? How do you interpret what happened in that race, and how should we understand it?
Well, I think a lot of it does have to do with trust, especially South Carolina. For him to have been able to, expectations were already higher for him going into South Carolina, and he beat them. And I think that reflects a level of trust, including trust with Southern Black voters, that no other candidate, not only candidates like me, but even candidates of color, he had something different. And I think part of it is longevity, just the idea that even if there was a sense that you didn't agree with him on everything or every choice that he'd made, there was a sense of who he was that just cut across all of that. There's also a kind of persistence, right? The fact that he didn't get discouraged by results that might have compelled others to question whether they were going to stay in the race. And I think that gets back to some of what we began this conversation talking about, a sense of awareness of the ups and downs of life, and a readiness for the lows to get pretty low in order for the highs to be what they could be. And I think all of that served him well as that those qualities we've been talking about that make him so recognizable and that really connect him to people, even if they're from a different generation or a different ideological province of our big tent party. And I think they're going to be very important for governing. So let me, I'll try not to be greedy and turn more to the audience questions, because there's one that touches on exactly this from Zebulon in Sweden, who asks, I think, a deceptively simple question. How do you think Mr. Biden would make decisions as president? He asks.
By the way, I have no illusions that the Swedish members of our group today are here to see me. They're here to see you, but I'm grateful for it. I think, look, that question is a fascinating one to me, because it's something that was running through a lot of my inquiry about him. How does his mind work? How does he take in information? How does he decide what to do? And I had some encounters with people who've worked with him closely in the White House and elsewhere, who said, in one particularly memorable encounter, one interview, somebody in the Obama administration said to me, look, the cliche about Joe Biden is that he talks too much. We know that. But what people don't seem to get is that he is listening. And here's an example of it. So, in this particular case, the person I was talking to said he would call me up and have me come in and brief him about things. And sure, he would sometimes talk for 90% of the occasion, but he would, at the end of it, he'd clap me on the back and he'd say, great talk. And I'd kind of go out of there a little dazed, but he would always pick something up. And I think and he would build it into his decision-making matrix. And you would hear him then use that fact or use that point of analysis. Again, you can make an obvious contrast with the current occupant of the White House, who can't seem to bring himself to read his own intelligence briefings. But in this case, you have somebody who is, and I think part of this comes, frankly, from a kind of productive insecurity that Joe Biden has had in his life. He, as he said on the stump, he is the first nominee without an Ivy League degree since Walter Mondale. And I think he carries with him a certain openness to continue to grasp for that new piece of information, that, as I put it in the book, the thing that he knows, that he doesn't know. And he wants that. And he's constantly seeking that. I mean, I'm guessing he probably would talk to you about that, trying to figure out what's happening in your part. It's
true, constantly. He'd ask me questions about things I knew about. He'd ask me questions about things I really didn't know much about, but who would have that humility to kind of want to pump you for information. I think you're right. That gets lost because, look, he can talk. I think we all know that, but he can listen. And he's always filled with those questions. And I can see that kind of process of seeking out and soaking up information, informing his decision-making. An interesting question about an institution we're all thinking about a lot right now, which is the Senate. Brett says the Senate is a unique and powerful legislative body in the U.S. imagination. Few have spent more time in it than Joe Biden. How do you think his background as a U.S. senator drives his understanding of the presidency and the role of government in general?
It's interesting. He is, to the molecular level, a senator. I mean, it is core to his conception of how human beings interact with each other. You mentioned before this idea that we can disagree on the first day, and then we can make a deal on Tuesday. And that's, that's a sort of senatorial way of looking at things. And I mean, to the point that, as I mentioned in the book, at one point when Joe Biden joined the vice presidency, he actually kept his locker in the Senate gym because he enjoyed going over there and just kibitzing with people. I mean, he really is a little bit like, an intelligence gatherer, where he would go over there and come back to the White House with little tidbits about just the color of the negotiations, the way things were going. I mean, that's who he is. And I think the problem with that in some ways, and I'll tell you about why I think it's okay, but there is a disadvantage to it. As Barack Obama said to me at one point, look, the problem is that Joe Biden came of age in a Senate which functioned. It was a Senate in which you could get things done. And it's been, to use Obama's word, it's been painful for Joe Biden to come to terms with what might need to be done to make the Senate functional again. And I think that's where we get back to some of these really important structural reform prospects, the question of whether, in fact, he will undertake something like getting rid of the filibuster. And we're at a point now where it is a basic question about whether the functioning of the Senate needs to be revised. I will point out, I think, Pete, you mentioned it in the book, and it's important for people to remember, these days we forget that we used to actually refresh the democratic functioning more often than we do. And one of the things you mentioned in trust is that every 10 years we used to do these kinds of reforms, and we don't do them now, right? I mean, how did that change? How did that become outside the boundaries of doable things?
It's true. It feels like we're out of practice as a country in revising some of these things, although you could argue the Senate Republicans have done it in their own way. For example, the idea of changing the number of justices on the Supreme Court. The only modern actor to actually do it was Mitch McConnell, who changed it to 8 until he took power again. But in terms of actually going through the motions of updating our democracy, even things like, one of the last voting related amendments we had, championed by Birch Bayh of Indiana in the 70s, to lower the voting age to 18 at a time when you could be old enough to be drafted in the military and yet not be old enough to vote on the leaders who were drafting you. And we do seem to be out of practice, but I think there is a moment of reform ahead. And it's interesting to see how many of those who actually are creatures of that old Senate. I mean, to see none other than Harry Reid come out for ending the filibuster, for example, I think really tells you that there's no danger of a dramatic reform destroying the Senate. That's kind of happened. It's really about how we're going to put it back together, and it's going to be really interesting to see how a President Biden will guide that. One anonymous attendee asks a question that's definitely just for me, which is off topic, but can we see Buddy and Truman before you end? These are the dogs who are resident around here. Unfortunately, no, they are out of the house at the moment. So they won't be making an appearance, but that also means we won't be interrupted, as we sometimes are, by their guarding the property.
There's still time left. They might find their way in. You never know.
They might. There's a question from another anonymous attendee that draws attention to the transition. And this is a period where I can't think of another time in certainly modern history where the window of transition has mattered more, where there's been more pressure on the people doing it. Maybe a little bit under President Obama during his arrival. And it's worth mentioning that actually, for all their dramatic differences, there was a remarkable degree of collaboration between the outgoing George W. Bush administration and the incoming Barack Obama administration to align legislation and relief for the Great Recession, because those crashes happening in September, October couldn't wait till January for there to be some kind of game plan. Maybe that gives us some inkling of what a good standard of a transition would look like. But even so, there's nothing like this. So the question is, how does Joe Biden mend the fabric of this country together during this transition? Both perhaps a period when it's ambiguous who the official winner will be, and then even after that, during all of the days waiting between election and inauguration.
Yeah, and I think I'm so glad you mentioned the fact that we often forget that even this very contested transition between the Bush presidency and the Obama presidency, there was quite a high level of collaboration, just even down to the kind of the functional handshake between the incoming department heads and outgoing department heads, which makes a huge difference. I mean, when we talk about the peaceful transition of power, we never used to think we were talking about a president who wouldn't acknowledge the result of a legitimate election. Right. But what we also meant was that we had this kind of extraordinary ability, almost unique among big powers of our kind, to be able to hand off this, what is effectively an enormous, complicated set of 250 companies working together is the federal government, to then do that every 4 years or every 8 years. And we did it between parties. Biden has an advantage in this regard, which is that he did come in, after all, in the Obama administration early on. One of his very first assignments that the president asked him to do was to take on the implementation of the stimulus bill. And so he had some sense of how do you essentially begin to retrofit or to fix the airplane while you're still flying at 30,000 feet. And that's what's going to be required. There is right now a very intensive process going on that you don't hear as much about in the news. That's partly by design, but it is a very serious plan to begin to know what can we do on day one. What could a Biden administration accomplish with executive action? Things like returning to Paris, things like returning to the World Health Organization, and then what is a legislative plan that might be different than the past? One of the things you hear very much from Joe Biden's advisors is we don't need to use the old playbook in which we more or less plan for 2 years of a highly sequenced, carefully choreographed legislative plan. We don't have a luxury for that. This is an emergency, and we're going to treat it like one and use all the tools at our disposal. And they know how to use the Congress. That's one thing they have experience doing.
It's a great point. And that leads to another question, or a theme that a lot of the questions are about, which is the distinction between a Biden presidency and an Obama presidency. They had this extraordinary partnership politically, but they also did so as two very different people. And that was part of the chemistry of the Obama-Biden administration. One questioner, Zach, put it this way. How does Biden, and he's mentioning that there's a lot of Obama-era veterans who are here, find a way to shape a Biden-1 administration, meeting the domestic and foreign policy challenges of 2021, versus sliding into a familiar playbook that yields a kind of what Zach calls an Obama-3 administration? Tim's got a similar question about what might be distinct about his presidential leadership comparatively.
I think there's a significant detail that we haven't even talked about today, which is that the world has fundamentally changed, even while we have been drawn into our own sort of domestic drama around President Trump. The nature of geopolitics have changed. China obviously plays a different role in the world than it did 4 years ago. The nature of democracy being in retreat in so many places presents another kind of crisis for this administration to contend with. And one of the things that I think you would find with a Biden administration, if it comes to pass, is that their project number one of the things they will have to do when they go out into the world is to begin to, in effect, reestablish American credibility. I mean, to use your word, to reestablish trust in what the United States represents. That was something similar that Obama had to do. I mean, he was coming out of the Iraq War experience. People were distrustful of what the United States, what its intentions were. And he began that process. The difference is Biden comes to this with some pre-existing relationships. I mean, somebody said to me at one point when I was writing the book, they said, you could drop Joe Biden. This is one of his foreign policy aides. They said, you can drop Joe Biden into any capital in the world and he'll know some Joe Blow, could be a socialist, could be a fascist. He will have met that person at some point along the way. And there's something valuable there for a country like ours in a moment of, let's call it what it is, reconstruction.
Yeah. So let's dig into that. It's rare to have a new president as sure-footed on foreign policy as Joe Biden is in terms of these relationships that you're talking about, and his tenure in the Senate, even before he came to the White House, where he insisted on being a central player in the national security and foreign policy decisions of the Obama-Biden administration too. And this is a lot of the questions are on this subject. And I don't want to miss the chance, especially to engage your insights on this. You were in the Middle East, China. John puts it well, says, Evan, DC, Joe Biden, China. So how's he going to handle Xi Jinping's China and all that that entails? Where does that story go?
Well, interestingly, one of the things that first got me interested in Joe Biden was when he came over to Beijing when I was living there. And he did a very unusual thing. Instead of eating inside the hotel, he and his staff, some of whom are still with him now working on China projects, they decided to go to a little restaurant in a very working class part of town, happened to be right around the corner from where I live. This is what caught my attention. And they
And
did
I'm
this.
going to pause there just for how remarkable this is, right? That's exactly the kind of thing a political figure does in Iowa, find a diner and go there. But if you're on a diplomatic mission in China, I don't even know how the security team lets you do that. So that's fascinating. But sorry to interrupt. That's remarkable.
It made his
touch and bring it to China.
His Secret Service details made their heads explode. They said, we're going where and we're going to do what exactly? So they go to this restaurant that specialized in stewed liver, and off he goes. And he goes into this place and he says to everybody, look, I know you guys came down here to have a quiet lunch, and here I am screwing it all up. And he got a kind of round of applause. For years afterwards, this little restaurant carried a Biden special on the menu. The reason he did that, and the reason why I mention it, is it wasn't just a sort of, it was a nice stunt, but it also had a deep meaning about the nature of the American and Chinese contrast in politics, which is that China at that point was going through this series of scandals around official corruption and luxury and self-dealing. And so by just making this subtle gesture, by saying we're not going to treat ourselves like we are a royal visiting party, we are in fact going to go and meet with people. He put the Chinese political class on notice. And afterwards, not too long after that, Xi Jinping, sure enough, went trooping out to go have lunch at a little dumpling restaurant in town. You can call it the Biden effect. I mean, there is something really fascinating. And there's a direct relevance to that now, because I think one of the things he has to do, one of the kinds of messages he will have to do as president is, if he has that opportunity, will be to begin to remind people around the world, but what is it actually to be a free country? What does it mean what are the countries that are today practicing democracy and doing the hard work of maintaining it and restoring it? And I think as we move into this phase, let's call it what it is, it's a phase in the world in which we have two governing systems, the American system and the Chinese system, contending and offering claims for a certain natural right, that it is incumbent on us, particularly now when we look when our democracy is weakened, to go out and begin to make that case again. And he comes at it from a point of sincerity, because he's been doing it for a while.
Coming back a little closer to home, I'm thinking about the question of unity within the coalition that is the Democratic Party, or maybe beyond the Democratic Party. I mean, one thing I took as very encouraging was the RNC didn't even have a lot of prominent Republicans. The Bushes wanted nothing to do with it, it seemed, or at least they weren't there. Obviously, no sign of the McCains or even previous RNC chairs. The Democratic convention, by contrast, had folks like AOC and Bernie Sanders, folks like me, folks like folks from the moderate wing of the party, and Republicans, not even former Republicans, but current Republicans, all saying, "Hey, we won't agree on everything. We got to be there for Joe Biden." I remember a year ago, one of the most frequent questions I would get if I were doing a panel or an appearance was, how can the Democratic coalition stay together even long enough to make it to election day? And I think it's worth remembering just how much that's exceeded expectations, how unified our side has been, how none of the kind of fears have really come to pass, which I think is a credit to Joe Biden's leadership, but also to the leadership of figures from the progressive wing of the party who have welcomed the invitation to be part of the conversation, and the involvement of independents and some Republicans who see something bigger at stake. But it's one thing to do that in a campaign. So Robert's question is, if Biden takes the oath of office in January, how will he deal with the many competing factions within the Democratic Party, trying to satisfy the different wings, especially, as Robert notes, because Democrats will have an imperative to avoid a repeat of the kind of midterm wipeout that we experienced in 2020 in the first midterm of the Obama White House. So what have you observed that might give us some insight on how he'll hold a complicated coalition together?
I'll answer that question, but I also I see the clock and I want to reserve a couple minutes for one more question for you, because it's something that you mentioned in the book that means a lot to me. The question of unity is an interesting one, because look, the truth is the left end of the party, of the Democratic Party, is going to start pressuring Joe Biden, if he wins, approximately 30 seconds after he wins. That is built into the nature of the system. And frankly, it should. I mean, that's how the system works. It should continue to push the party, because that's otherwise that's how you get the kind of stasis and ultimately how you fall out of touch with the demands that people have. Now, there's a difference between pushing and seeking to undermine the possibility of progress. And that's the boundary between optimism and cynicism. And ultimately, you know, as somebody said to me, a progressive activist said, look, if we find ourselves in the fortunate position to have a Joe Biden presidency, we will have to figure out how you go from protest to persuasion. How do you actually get things done without being self-righteous? And I think that is it's sort of incumbent on all of us as citizens to decide, well, how do we face forward without just tearing somebody down? You know, the question I wanted to ask, because it's just a hugely important piece of your book about trust, is about national service. And you mentioned this early. It's something that I think about a lot, coming back to this country after being overseas for a number of years. We've talked about unity today over and over. And one of the things that you came to after thinking so hard about trust is that the sheer experience of doing something together, you know, of laboring for a purpose larger than yourself, has this kind of almost sort of a miraculous effect on your view of yourself as a person. You've seen it in your life, both in citizen life and in military life. And we have some institutions that can do it. But it feels to me like we are approaching a moment when we're ready for something bigger. I mean, there was a moment before the Peace Corps, and then there was the Peace Corps. I wonder how you think about national service, why it's important, and what it might take for us to reach that new phase.
Yeah. You know, I think America always does better when we have a project, a national project of some kind. In some ways, the entire Cold War amounted to such a thing. World War II certainly did, but it's not always a war. The moon landing in some ways had that same spirit, even if not as many Americans were participating directly in it. And I think right now we've got no shortage of demanding, urgent, even existentially important national projects ahead of us, of which conquering this pandemic might be the most immediate. But something like conquering climate change is no less urgent. A lot of these would benefit from engaging more Americans in more ways. And that's part of the promise of national service. But I raise it not just because I believe there's good work waiting to be done, but really, as you teed up in your question, it's the experience itself. Even if the work weren't quite so urgent, it is. But even leaving that aside, just the fact that more Americans would have some occasion to deal with other Americans in a collaborative way, who they might have nothing in common with besides being American. That's what I experienced in the military. There might be nothing besides the uniform we were wearing and the flag on our shoulder to connect me to somebody who would have different background or different racial background or very different politics a lot of the time. The people I trust my life to in a heartbeat because of the pressures that we were under and the mission that was in front of us. And I don't think you have to go to war in order to get that. That's why I'm excited about what lining up the funding for more voluntary national service opportunities would be like, not only for young people, but especially for young people. I don't think we have to make people do it, but we could make it such a norm and properly pay for it so that everybody could afford. It wasn't a luxury. You make enough to get by. Then it would get to where it was close to universal. And I think that would do so much good. And it's an idea that I'm excited about because I don't think it's a partisan idea, but I think it would help us deal with some of our political estrangement. So I write about what that might mean in the book. And there are a lot of folks like Senator Biden's great ally in the Senate, Chris Coons, who have laid out legislation that doesn't really require us to invent a lot of new departments to do this. So you basically just fund some of the instruments we've already got. Every state in the union already has a commission on service that helps deal with things like AmeriCorps, that if we gave them more resources, they could bring in more people. And I hope that idea gets more attention in this decade.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that surprised me that you mentioned in the book is that for AmeriCorps, you know, that the rate is less than 1 in 5. The people who want to get in, there's not enough spaces for them. Right. So, you know, in some ways, this is a practical answer to this big question we're all thinking about, which is how do you actually unify a country? One of the ways you do it is by taking practical steps of the kind you outlined. So exactly. I learned a lot from it.
Exactly. Well, I think our time is drawing to a close, but I am so thankful to have been able to visit with you and again encourage everyone to read what really amounts to a handbook on the style and the character and the priorities of the person who, if I get my way, and most Americans do, I think, agree on this, ought to be and will be the next president of the United States. Evan Osnos, thanks so much for the chance to be here, and I will turn it back over to you, Bradley, and thanks again for hosting us here at Politics and Prose.
Mayor Pete, great moderating. You definitely have a knack for this sort of thing too. And we're grateful for your being here this afternoon. And Evan, congrats again on a terrific book, a book that, as this afternoon's discussion made clear, it does help us much better understand a very public figure whom we think we know, but who, as you convey, has even more to him. To everyone watching, a reminder that you can find a link in the chat column to buy Evan's book, Joe Biden. And if you haven't already, now is a good time to go vote in the election. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.